Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to say we're joined by Adela Cojab, who's joining us from Manhattan. Now, Adela is a passionate, outspoken advocate for the Jewish people and for Israel, and she puts her money where her mouth is because she's fought lawsuits against a college campus that has been hostile to Israel, and we've seen a lot of that in the past year. And she has just a great story of connecting to Judaism, a Jewish heritage, and not just connecting with it for herself, but sharing it publicly. She's a fantastic advocate in spreading the light of the Jewish people to the world. And that's something we need to be seeing much more of today. And it's really going to be the topic of our conversation. I want to talk about how we as Jewish people, both in Israel and around the world, can spread our light and can share and teach and educate and use our voices to actually demystify people's notions about us and share it with the world. So Adela, first of all, thank you so much for joining us on JTV. It's really greatly appreciated. I want to start by, if you could just share with our audience a bit about your own story and how I was reading a bit about it online, how you kind of reconnected with your Jewish heritage through your younger years.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. So my family's from Syria and Lebanon, and then they moved to Mexico. That's where I was born. And then we moved to Deal, New Jersey, where there's a big Syrian Jewish community. So generally for me, I always grew up in a community where Judaism, Zionism, it was always part of who I was. It was never questioned. I went to yeshiva day school growing up. I go home for Shabbat, kosher, everything was really laid out for me, and it was never something I questioned. But when I decided to go to college, I said, Judaism's great, it's part of who I am, but I don't want to be known as that Jewish girl in college. I really wanted to branch out of my circles. So I didn't stay in the Jewish dorm. I had a radio show with WNYU Radio at New York University, and of course, I joined student government. And I remember when I got to campus trying to not be the Jewish girl, NYU had been my dream school. And literally when my advisor said, well, what if you don't get in? I said I would go to Israel to volunteer for a year, and then I'll just apply again because NYU felt like the school I wanted to go to. And I got to campus wanting to be an uninvolved Jew, and instead I ended up coming across a group of Jewish students with Israeli flags. And I didn't know them, and they didn't know me, but they gave me a flag, and I took it, and we got in the circle, and they started talking about a bus bombing that happened earlier that week, where a couple of people lost their lives in Israel. This is October 2015. And they started talking about Ezra Schwartz, who passed away, and who was murdered by terrorists. And he had been doing a gap year volunteering before college. And it kind of became this moment for me when I stood in the circle with complete strangers holding my flag, singing Hatikva, saying, how did I go from a yeshiva education to not even knowing that someone my age lost their life doing something I could have been doing in that moment? And that was kind of like my first awakening, where I said, I don't need to look for a cause to fight for if I already have my own. And I continued through NYU. I ended up being extremely involved. I definitely became the Jewish girl, the thing I wanted to avoid. Not in a bad way, but I became president of the pro-Israel group. I was the Jewish senator on student government. And when everything turned to Israel and Palestine, I kind of found myself in the forefront of this. And in 2018, we started seeing what started with the typical BDS you would see across college campuses, but it quickly escalated to intensive boycotts. We had boycotts on student government, then we had 70 professors sign a BDS pledge, and then 53 groups signed a BDS pledge, not only against the state of Israel, but Realize Israel, the group that I was president of. So if you were a Jewish student, your student government was against you, student groups wouldn't work with you, and your professor was openly boycotting your country. So things got really intense, and it got to the point that when I was meeting with the school, again, they told me I was overreacting, but we were having a Yom HaAtzmaut celebration where we rent out Washington Square, 300 kids, Israeli flags, gorgeous event. But I knew that year would be different. I asked for security for the Jewish community and for all students to ensure student safety. I was told I was overreacting, and the way the event kicked off was with an anti-Israel student burning an Israeli flag, and then later assaulting a Jewish girl while we sang Hatikva, and then tearing our flags, hanging them from trees and lampposts, chanting "No Zionists" at NYU, and NYPD stepped in and made 2 arrests. At that point, I told the school something had to be done. The school promised action. I had been boycotted out of student government and replaced with someone from Students for Justice in Palestine. I was boycotted out of the Middle Eastern Studies department. No one would work with me. My professors even told me to stop coming to class because my presence was a distraction, and I had to take my final exams in a separate room. So my senior year, I took a full step back. So I kind of went from being not wanting to be involved in Judaism to being the most involved with Judaism and Zionism, to taking a full step back, starting taking classes in creative writing and dance while I was a Middle Eastern Studies major, really just getting the credits to graduate. And it wasn't until the last 3 months of my senior year when NYU, instead of doing something about anti-Semitism, gave an award to Students for Justice in Palestine, that I was kind of called up again, right? I had said, and this is going to be a common theme, as you'll see, I had said, I did what I needed to do. I gave 3 years of my life to this. It's my time to move on. My friends had asked me, can you get us a meeting with the vice president of the school? They kept saying, you have to do something. I said, it's not my job anymore, not my place anymore. They asked if I'd just get them the meeting. I said yes. And when I tried to get them the meeting, the vice president of NYU dodged my calls for weeks. So I went physically to his office, tried to get a meeting with him. He refused to sit down with me. And he scheduled our meeting for the week of my graduation. That's when I realized NYU didn't want to do anything, and that's when I got in touch with lawyers. I asked if I had a case. They said no, because Title VI of the Civil Rights Act at the time didn't protect Judaism. It only protected ethnicity, nationality, and race. But they told me my case was so strong it could become the cornerstone in Jewish history in the U.S. when it comes to the law and protection under the Civil Rights Act. So I made the decision to file, and when everything went to press, the vice president called me, asked me to come to his office, and I said, I'm really busy. Can't come in until May. But ultimately, I did come in. I spent months after my graduation making as much publicity for my case as I could, because again, my lawyers told me, you're going to lose, but this case could be the foot in the door. And after making publicity, my case ended up reaching the White House. I got a call from the White House team. At the time, President Trump was in office. And they asked me to speak with him at a conference in Miami, which I did. And 3 days later, he signed the executive order on anti-Semitism. That, what it did was expand the definition of Judaism from a faith-based religion to an ethno-religion, thereby falling under ethnic protections of Title VI. So it was a roundabout way to ensure Jewish student protection. And now this is 2019. So we're talking 5 years ago. I spent the next 2 years advocating for Jewish students. I worked with the Maccabee Task Force. They flew me in whenever there was some sort of emergency on a campus to put out fires, map campuses, fight BDS resolutions. And after 2 years of that, I said, my time here is done. It's time to move on. I decided to go to law school.
I'm going to guess what's happening next.
Yep. I got internships with the district attorney of Queens, the district attorney of Brooklyn. I was going to be a prosecutor, got my offer for after graduation, and I was so ready to graduate and become a prosecutor to protect all of the citizens of New York. And then lo and behold, October 7th. And October 7th changed my reality. Next thing you know, my phone is blowing up with students who are going through way worse anti-Semitism than what I saw. Asking me what they could do legally about it. And I started speaking at events. I had 2-3 events a day. I became a correspondent with Univision and Telemundo. They had a van stationed outside of my campus, and I'd go down between classes to do interviews for them. And that's kind of when I realized I was called up again. Right? I'm very much a mission-driven person. I always have been a mission-driven person. When people say, well, what gave you the courage? What gave you the strength? I have a lot of answers, but bottom line, I understand that Hashem chose a path for me, and all I had to do was take it. And I saw that back when I was at NYU, and I had the decision, do I file a case or do I just graduate? And then I saw it again on October 7th. Do I continue my path as a prosecutor, or do I realize that anyone can prosecute a stabbing in Brooklyn? Not everyone can do what I'm doing now. So I did graduate from law school, and now I'm working full-time in advocacy. I work for the National Jewish Advocacy Center, and we're taking up all these cases, not just against schools, but against the Associated Press, who bought pictures directly from Hamas. And we're not using discrimination law. We're using counterterrorism law, because that's cut and dry. It's not about discretion. It's not about, well, I felt discriminated. No, no, no. This is a bright line. You're providing material support for terrorism. Shut it down.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. And I'm curious to know, you touched on that, since October 7th, things have become even more magnified in terms of the things you saw when you were on campus. Can you just touch on that? And also, what would you say are some of the things that Jewish people and Israel sympathetic students can do actively now when they are confronted with these things?
Yeah, 100%. So we saw every campus across America explode, right? The calls I was getting from students from Cooper Union, for example. Cooper Union is a small engineering school. It's not a liberal arts college. It's not a big university. It's a small engineering school. The students, the Jewish students that were in the library, library got surrounded and mobbed, and they couldn't leave. They had security with them at all times. They were in the basement of a library while students outside were banging down the doors. It was insanity. It looked like a pogrom. And that was just one of the many calls I was getting from students, right? And of course, we have all the typical New York campuses. We have Columbia, we have my alma mater, NYU, which has been doing such a wonderful job fighting anti-Semitism. It's insane because the professors themselves are the ones who are leading this call. So if you're a student on campus, it's one thing when your fellow students are protesting something, but when you show up to an encampment trying to get to your campus and to walk through, and your professor is the one blocking your way, what are Jewish students supposed to do? Because when you think about it, the last time I saw people linking arms outside a library preventing their peers from entering was during the Civil Rights Act. That was during the time where white Americans wouldn't allow black Americans to study in the same universities as them because they demonized their existence, right? They shouldn't have access to equal resources. That was the last time that we saw such a blatant form of discrimination on a college campus. The difference is that now they're masking it as politics and calling it Zionism when we know that they mean Jews. So what can Jewish students do right now? I always say there's two things you can do. First off, you need to get informed. You need to actually know what it is that you're fighting for. I grew up in a very Jewish Zionist community. You think I ever asked myself what that meant? You think I ever asked myself why I was pro-Israel? Absolutely not. We didn't have AIPAC, we didn't have Hasbara, we didn't have any of these phenomenal organizations, we didn't have Stand With Us. That just didn't exist when I was on campus. So I found myself discovering all of this when I was being confronted by it. So I think that right now students are starting off at a way higher point than I am. I speak a lot to high schools and I tell them, I didn't have this growing up. So you're already starting much better off than I did, which means that I'm not worried for the future. And the second thing that they can do is they can finally be proactive about it. Right now, we haven't seen what we saw last spring, right? So right now is a time that Jewish students should be going to their administrators and say, look, we don't want a situation like NYU. We don't want a situation like Columbia. Instead of waiting for a lawsuit, how about right now you define anti-Semitism, you include it in their discrimination policy, and you put a pathway in place on how to deal with it? Because my issue at NYU, I don't think administrators are anti-Semitic. I think that they're just lazy. And if they don't have a pathway on how to, number one, recognize anti-Semitism, and number two, once you recognize it, know how to fight it, or know how to react to it at the very least, what are the consequences, then they're not going to take any action. Again, not because they're anti-Semitic, but because they're simply lazy. So right now that things are calm is the time that Jewish students should be showing up to their campus, showing up to their administrators, and saying it's time to take proactive action. Don't wait for this to become Columbia. Don't wait for this to become NYU. Let's nip it in the bud.
And what do you think should be the balance between us saying we have to do things like lawfare, as you say, and being strategic and just pushing back, versus actually trying to win the PR war, trying to demystify, educate, share? Of course we need both. No one's questioning that. But what do you think should be like the ratio?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that for me, I've been trying to walk this line. So I do a lot of social media where I do videos explaining what's been going on. I have a YouTube channel called Today Unpacked, where we unpack the biggest stories of the day when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But at the same time, my day in, day out is training students and working in law. So I've been trying to walk the line. Personally, if you're asking me which one I think is more important, I think it's time to use the law. I think that right now the most important thing that we can do is put things down on paper. There's a saying, I didn't say this, I forgot who said it, so if you remember the quote, let me know. I'd rather be a hated Jew than a dead one.
Golda Meir,
So
yeah.
Golda Meir, there we go. And I'd rather be a hated Jew than a dead one. Right now at this point, I'm not trying to win a PR battle. I'm trying to come to the United States and say, you have laws on the books against discrimination. You can't pick and choose what minorities it applies to. It's time to protect Jewish students, whether or not that's your goal. So I think that once we get everything under wraps, then we can work a little bit more on the PR. And, I talk a lot to Israelis, right? And I realize that this war is happening on multiple fronts. And if I had to choose which one to fight, I'm glad I'm on the social media side, because the war that 18-year-olds in Israel are fighting right now
Right.
is a lot more real, a lot more scary, and has a lot higher stakes. So when I speak to Americans here, I tell them, I know it might seem scary to post something on your story because your coworkers might think differently of you. But again, understand we're all in this war together, and the battle you have is much easier than the battle they do.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's why I'm not disheartened. I think it's important to keep posting.
I suppose part of the root of why I ask about the whole PR question is I wonder what, to what extent do the grassroots, the people on the ground, actually have such hostile views to Israel? We know some of these Western elite institutions, academia, media, politicians, but actually people on the ground. Do you have any sense of like the average student? Are most of them actually just maybe disinterested, or maybe they can be persuaded, or what's your sense?
So that's a really good question. And on every college campus, you'll find the fundamentalists, and then you'll find the human rightsers. And you can really tell which is which. And the way that I like to frame it is the Armenian genocide in Turkey, right? It's something that most college students vaguely know about. They vaguely heard about it. And if someone on their campus was like, hey, would you sign this petition against Turkey for the Armenian genocide because it's time that the Armenian people get, the rights that they deserve and reparations for the discrimination that they faced and the ethnic cleansing, and they use all these terms. If you're a typical college student, you say, yeah, absolutely, you signed that petition. And then you feel good about yourself because you helped the Armenians fight against the Turkish Armenian genocide. That's Israel Palestine for them. They don't know the difference between anything. They don't understand right from wrong, left from right. The difference is that they've been doing the groundwork, laying the narrative a lot better than we have for years. They've been fighting this war for 20 plus years, especially on college campuses. And the fact, for example, that they had Students for Justice in Palestine, which was an advocacy-centric group, for the last 20 years on college campuses. And we only recently, 5 years ago, started student supporting Israel, which is the Jewish counterpart, or I guess the Israeli counterpart. We are very much behind. So this is a battle that we had already lost. The typical student is uninvolved, but they're going to be neutral to negative, right? The same way that they hear about Russia and Ukraine, the same way they hear about China and Taiwan, they're going to hear about Israel and Palestine. So it fits really well into the dichotomy that they've created in their mind of the big oppressor against the small oppressed, and they've been laying this PR world. Again, of course, when you take a step back, you understand that it's not Israel against Palestinians in Gaza or Israel against Palestinians in the West Bank. You understand it's the entirety of the Arab world against a small country, Israel. If we want to talk about right to exist, right, countries are created either by treaty or by war. Israel first had a treaty, and then it had a war, which was a defensive war. If any country has a right to exist, it's Israel. What does right to exist even mean? You might not like the fact that Israel won, but Israel won. We can have all the arguments, of course, but you'll never even get to that conversation with someone because they don't know enough. I mean, very much evident when you go into these protests and you ask what river, what sea, and they don't know. That's exactly it. If I asked you if it was, from the river to the sea, the Armenians will be free, and I asked someone what river, what sea, they definitely don't know. Right. So it's you have to put it in that same framework where if you're an uninvolved student, you're an uninvolved student. You don't know. You kind of care, but you kind of don't. And you like to be part of the crowd.
Absolutely. So, and I agree. And in some ways, this is good news because ignorance can be replaced, right? As opposed to like deeply poisonous anti-Semitic hatred that's just runs so deep that science it can be impossible to change. So, on that note, and my last question to you is this: for young Jewish people watching, of any Jewish person watching, really, what do you think is like one message that you feel is really important that we as a Jewish people need to be getting out to the world in order to really demystify ourselves, reshape perspectives? I know it's such a tough question because I'm sure there's so many things that you'd like to say, but what would you say is like for you is like such an important message that you'd want us to be getting out more?
I think the most important message, especially coming from the lawfare perspective, is that everything that's happening now and everything that Jews are asking for, it's not about special treatment for Jews. It's not about Jewish exceptionalism. This is all about equal rights and equal protection. I think that if we reframe ourselves not as fighting anti-Semitism, but fighting for equal rights, that's how we make it. Not only in the legal space, because that's the case we have to make legally, but also in public opinion. Everyone says, well, why should Jewish students get special protections? Well, no other student gets this, no other student gets that. You say, no, 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 it's not about special protection. It's about equal protection under the law. There's laws in the books to protect minorities. We are a minority, and it's about time that we fight for our place in this country because we belong as much as everyone else. And the one message I wish Jews would know for themselves is that when things get scary, it doesn't mean it's time to run. And I know that that seems so natural because of generational trauma, right? If you come from Eastern Europe, if you come from Western Europe, or if you come from the Middle East, like my family, at some point your family fled. The reason why we're here, the reason why we have Jews in London, the reason why we have Jews in Panama and Brazil is because at some point our ancestors had to flee. That's not what we should be doing right now. We live in the era of rights where every single minority group is fighting for their place and they're all putting their foot down, claiming their space. But Jewish people are afraid to do that. We'll fight for the civil rights of every other group except for our own. When it comes to us, we step to the side, right? So when things get scary, it's not time to pull your kids out of colleges and send them to yeshiva university, just as it's not time to pull yourself out of the United States and make aliyah. That's a fear response. That's a trauma fear response. We fought so hard to get rights in this country. We fought so hard to make it to those universities that didn't allow Jews in their doors in the first place. We fought way too hard to just decide it's not worth the fight, give it up, and retreat back home when it gets scary. So that's what I would tell all Jews.
Absolutely, and you're right. No more fear, no more intimidation, and the time is different now. We live in a time where we have political, social, and religious and economic rights, and because of that, we are living really in an unprecedented moment in Jewish history where we have the ability to articulate our voice to the world, and more than that, also I believe the light of Judaism and all the wonderful wisdom and incredible heritage that we have to share with the world. Adela, thank you so much, not just for your time, but for all you're doing to fight on behalf of Jewish people and their rights and for Israel. It's really greatly appreciated. And thank you for making the time to speak to our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.